By 1943, the skies over Europe were alive with fire and thunder. The Second World War had become a contest of machines as much as men. Every battle, every bombing raid, and every dogfight depended on the aircraft that ruled the air. The Luftwaffe had once dominated those skies, sweeping aside opponents with speed and precision. But as the war dragged on, that supremacy began to crumble under the sheer weight of Allied industry and innovation. Out of the factories of the United States came an aircraft that would change the balance of power in the air, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. At first glance, it looked far too heavy and ungainly to be a fighter. It was enormous, with thick wings and a bulky fuselage, earning it the nickname, the Jug. But beneath its rugged exterior was a monster of an engine, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. The P-47 was a triumph of American engineering and industrial might. It could climb to high altitudes faster than most German fighters, dive at astonishing speeds, and return home riddled with bullets that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Its pilots came to trust it as both a shield and a weapon. To the Luftwaffe, which faced these powerful escorts above the clouds, the Thunderbolt became a symbol of Allied superiority. The secret to the Thunderbolt's unmatched performance lay not only in its raw horsepower but in the sophisticated turbo-supercharging system that boosted its power at high altitudes. This system allowed the P-47 to maintain engine output where German fighters struggled to breathe. The Americans had perfected the art of controlling exhaust gases to drive a turbine, compress air, and feed it back into the engine, a complex feat of thermodynamics and metallurgy that required materials and precision machining far beyond what the Axis could mass-produce in wartime. Meanwhile, in Germany, engineers were working tirelessly to close the gap. Companies like Daimler-Benz, Junkers, and BMW were producing their own masterpieces, the DB605, Jumo 213, and BMW 801 engines powered some of the most famous Luftwaffe aircraft, including the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190. These engines were elegant and powerful, but they were reaching their limits. Without access to the same quantities of high-quality alloys, without the industrial depth to build complex turbo systems, the Germans struggled to match the reliability and power of the R-2800. As the Allied bombing campaign intensified, Thunderbolts began to escort the great formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into occupied Europe. The Luftwaffe pilots who tried to stop them quickly learned that attacking these new escorts was a deadly gamble. The P-47 could dive faster than anything the Germans had in the sky. It could take punishment and keep fighting. And it could stay aloft long enough to follow the bombers all the way to their targets, and back. For the engineers of the Reich, this raised a troubling question: how could a fighter so large and heavy perform so well? Rumors circulated among German pilots about the giant American engine that gave the Thunderbolt its terrifying speed and endurance. Then, late in the war, a rare opportunity presented itself. A P-47 was forced down behind German lines, damaged, but largely intact. The Luftwaffe quickly recovered it and brought it to one of their testing centers. To the German scientists and engineers who examined it, the P-47 was a revelation. They had built engines of great complexity and ingenuity, but the American design seemed to combine brute strength with astonishing precision. The turbo-supercharger system was particularly shocking, a maze of ducts, turbines, and intercoolers that worked seamlessly to deliver enormous power even at 30,000 feet. The materials were of exceptional quality, resistant to heat and wear in ways the Germans could no longer replicate due to shortages of critical metals like nickel and chromium. What they saw inside that engine was more than just clever design. It was the embodiment of a different kind of war effort, one driven by mass production, resource abundance, and industrial organization. The United States could not only build such a complex engine but produce thousands of them with consistent quality. The German engineers took meticulous notes, disassembled components, and wrote detailed reports. Their conclusion was sobering: the P-47's engine was beyond their capability to duplicate under the conditions of 1944. It was not a matter of intelligence or ingenuity, but of scale and resources. In the skies, the Thunderbolt roared on, its engine a symbol of the industrial power fueling the Allied advance. For the Germans who studied it, the captured P-47 was a glimpse into the future, a future they realized they could not reach before the war ended. The Thunderbolt that would astonish German engineers did not fall from the sky in glory, it came down wounded and exhausted. Early in 1944, During a long-range escort mission over northern France, a P-47 of the 56th Fighter Group was hit by flak. The pilot nursed the aircraft westward, engine coughing, until the fuel system began to fail. With no chance of crossing the channel, he looked for open ground and coaxed the heavy fighter into a forced landing near the small town of Meaux. The Jug skidded through a field, snapping its propeller but remaining largely intact. The pilot was captured. His aircraft was quickly surrounded by curious villagers and German soldiers who had never been so close to the famed American fighter. Within hours, Luftwaffe recovery units arrived. Their orders were precise: salvage every piece. The P-47 was a mystery worth studying. Under the supervision of technical officers, the wreck was winched onto a flatbed truck and covered with tarpaulins to keep prying eyes away. Soldiers guarded it through the night as the convoy rolled east toward Reims, then onto a Luftwaffe evaluation center. Along the route, even hardened troops stopped to stare at the massive plane, astonished by its size. Compared with the lithe Bf-109s and Fw-190s they knew, the American machine looked more like a bomber's front half than a fighter. When the transport reached the test facility, engineers from several firms were already waiting, men from BMW, Daimler-Benz, and Junkers. These were Germany's top minds in aircraft propulsion. They had been briefed on the new Allied engines but had never examined one up close. Now, before them stood a machine whose reputation for power and resilience had become legend. Under bright hangar lights they began their inspection, moving slowly, methodically, as though studying a captured creature. The aircraft's skin bore bullet scars and streaks of oil, yet its structure remained solid. Even damaged, it seemed unbreakable. They first measured the fuselage and wings, muttering comparisons with the Fw-190A series. Then they turned their attention to the nose, the heart of the Thunderbolt. Removing the cowling revealed the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, a sight that left several men quietly shaking their heads. The engine was huge, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 perfect rows, every line and pipe precisely routed. One observer later wrote that the workmanship was like nothing from any German factory. The exhaust system was even more surprising. Instead of the simple waste gas outlets used on most European aircraft, this engine fed its gases through long ducts to a separate turbo-supercharger mounted far behind the cockpit, then routed the compressed air forward again. The setup looked impossibly complex. An orchestra of metal tubing and valves designed to make the engine breathe at high altitude. Technicians removed panels, photographing each stage. They were amazed by the materials, heat-resistant alloys that their own factories could no longer produce in quantity. Nickel, chromium, and cobalt, metals scarce in Germany by 1944, were everywhere in the American engine. One metallurgist tapped a manifold with his knuckle and murmured, "Impossible to forge here now." Others noted the engine's ruggedness. Every component seemed built with generous safety margins, designed for long service rather than delicate precision. To men accustomed to engines that demanded constant care, the double Wasp looked nearly indestructible. The aircraft systems told a similar story. Hydraulic lines were color-coded and standardized, connectors fitted with self-sealing couplings, electrical wiring carefully insulated. The Germans recognized these touches as products of an industrial culture that valued interchangeability and volume production. They could design brilliant engines, but they could not build them by the tens of thousands with such consistency. The Thunderbolt's very existence was proof that America's factories had become an extension of its battlefields. As the days passed, teams drafted detailed reports. Sketch artists reproduced the turbo-supercharger layout, while others mapped airflow paths through the intercoolers. The more they studied, the clearer the conclusion became: the Allies had achieved something Germany could not replicate under siege and scarcity. A senior engineer summarized it bluntly: "It is not that we cannot understand it. It is that we cannot build it." The captured P-47 was eventually reassembled for limited testing. Its battered engine ran briefly under German supervision, belching smoke but still producing astonishing thrust. The hangar filled with the deep roar of 18 cylinders, a sound that impressed even those who had designed the BMW 801. Observers recorded temperature and pressure readings until the engine ceased, its long journey finally over. Yet the knowledge gained from this Flugzeug, captured aircraft, was priceless to its examiners. They had glimpsed the industrial philosophy behind Allied air power, abundance, reliability, and a willingness to trade elegance for sheer strength. When they filed their final report in early 1945, the engineers knew that the war was already lost. The P-47 had not merely survived, it had demonstrated a world of manufacturing and materials science that Germany, despite all its genius, could no longer reach. Inside the hangar, the captured Thunderbolt stood stripped of its armor, panels removed, its veins and bones exposed. What had once been an instrument of war now looked like a specimen under dissection. Around it moved the best technical minds of the Reich, engineers who had spent their careers pushing piston engines to the limits of physics. They were not men easily impressed. Yet, as they studied the heart of the American fighter, they were forced into an unfamiliar feeling, admiration. The Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine was unlike anything they had encountered in European aircraft. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 perfect radial rows, air-cooled rather than liquid-cooled, each cylinder capped with its own set of pushrods and spark plugs. Where German engines relied on delicate water jackets and coolant pumps, this one simply breathed air. To the Germans, it seemed crude, almost brutal, but it worked. The engine's simplicity was deceptive, beneath its tough exterior lay engineering precision that was both elegant and pragmatic. Every surface, every bolt, every line had been designed for durability in mass production. They measured the compression ratios, examined the cylinder heads, and inspected the massive crankshaft. The tolerances were not as fine as those in a Daimler-Benz or Junkers engine, yet the Americans had compensated with materials and clever design. The pistons were forged from high-strength alloys that resisted heat and wear, and the bearing surfaces showed minimal scoring even after combat use. It was built not for one perfect flight, but for hundreds of rough ones. One German technician remarked quietly, "This motor could survive a war by itself." What fascinated them most was the R-2800's ability to maintain power at altitude. German engines, powerful at low and medium levels, often gasped for air above 25,000 feet. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, seemed to grow stronger the higher it climbed. The secret was not in the cylinders, but in the sprawling system behind them, the turbo-supercharger assembly. To the engineers, it looked like something from another world. Exhaust gases from the engine traveled through long ducts to a turbine in the tail, where they spun a compressor that forced fresh air back into the engine at high pressure. The system was massive, adding weight and complexity that German designers would have considered unacceptable. But the Americans had made it work flawlessly. The Germans had tried similar experiments early in the war with the BMW 801 and the Jumo 213, but their efforts had been limited by materials and reliability issues. The heat and pressure inside a turbocharger demanded metals that could withstand temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius. By 1944, Germany simply didn't have enough high-grade nickel or chromium to build such parts. The Americans, with their vast industrial resources, did. That was the true secret of the R-2800, not just the engineering brilliance, but the industrial power that stood behind it. One metallurgist studying the turbine blades noted that the alloy composition was far beyond anything they could replicate. The Americans were using nickel-chromium steels with tight grain structures and consistent tempering, the kind of metallurgical precision only possible through mass production consistency. Even the castings were smooth, free of the bubbles and imperfections common in wartime German alloys. "They have factories that are laboratories," one man said, almost in disbelief. When they tested the electrical ignition system, they found redundancy in every circuit. Dual magnetos ensured that if one failed, the other would keep the engine running. The lubrication system was equally advanced, automatic pressure regulation, self-sealing hoses, and accessible service points clearly designed with field maintenance in mind. Everything about the engine suggested it had been made not just for engineers, but for mechanics, men working under fire, in mud and cold, who could swap out entire assemblies with minimal tools. It was practical genius, not theoretical perfection. As the team documented their findings, comparisons to their own designs became unavoidable. The Daimler-Benz DB605 that powered the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a marvel of compact, high-efficiency engineering, but it was delicate. It demanded constant attention and precise cooling. The BMW 801 of the FW190 was tough but still fell short of the R2800's reliability and sustained power. The American engine, though heavier and less refined, could operate at maximum throttle for hours without melting pistons or losing oil pressure. To the Germans, this was almost incomprehensible. Over several weeks, the Luftwaffe engineers wrote their technical evaluation. Their conclusion was as much philosophical as mechanical: the Americans had chosen a different path. They had traded art for endurance, precision for resilience. And in a war that rewarded what lasted, not what dazzled, that choice had proved decisive. When the final report reached Berlin, senior officials read it with mixed emotions. Respect for the technology, and despair that it had come too late to match. The heart of the Thunderbolt was more than an engine, it was a symbol of a nation that could combine science, industry, and manpower on a scale the Reich could not equal. In the quiet hangar, after the tests were finished, one young engineer lingered by the engine stand. The massive radial loomed before him, silent now, its cylinders dark and cold. He reached out and touched the metal, still faintly warm from the day's work. "This," he whispered, "is how you win a war, not with one man's genius, but with 1,000 hands." The captured Thunderbolt, now stripped of its skin, became the centerpiece of a quiet scientific theater. Inside the Luftwaffe's research hangar, the American machine rested under arc lamps whose light revealed every curve of metal, every rivet and cable. The floor was cluttered with open toolboxes, sheets of paper, and oil-stained notebooks. Around it moved a circle of men, engineers, officers, and mechanics, each absorbed in the strange anatomy before them. To them, this was not an aircraft anymore. It was a mystery to be solved. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's technical divisions were running out of illusions. Their factories were shrinking under the rain of Allied bombs, and their resources were stretched to the breaking point. Yet they still maintained the discipline of scientists. The Thunderbolt presented an opportunity, a glimpse into the machinery of the enemy's success. The German Aviation Ministry had ordered its most experienced teams to document every detail, engine, structure, controls, and weapons. Nothing was to be discarded, nothing ignored. At Adlershof, near Berlin, the dissection began in earnest. The hangar smelled of oil, hot metal, and cigarette smoke. A blackboard near the wing displayed chalk notes in neat handwriting, airframe stress calculations, propeller gear ratios, cooling system pressures. The engineers worked in silence broken only by the click of rulers and the scratch of pencils. From overhead catwalks, military observers watched, their faces unreadable. What struck the Germans first was not complexity but clarity. The Thunderbolt's design had a logic that spoke of mass production. Panels were interchangeable, fastened with standardized fittings, labeled for assembly line workers rather than engineers. Cables were color-coded, components were accessible without removing large sections of the fuselage. It was an aircraft built for a nation that thought in thousands, not dozens. In contrast, German aircraft were often handmade, each one slightly different, demanding meticulous adjustments. When the airframe was lifted by crane, the German technicians were astonished by the sheer bulk of the fuselage. The P-47's armor plating and radial engine had given it a reputation for survivability that pilots respected and enemies feared. Here was the proof: steel reinforcement around the cockpit, thick sections protecting the oil cooler and fuel tanks. They built a flying fortress around a single pilot, one engineer remarked, half in awe, half in envy. Attention soon shifted to the wings. As they removed the panels, the men discovered fuel tanks integrated into the structure, self-sealing and coated in rubberized layers to prevent fire. German aircraft had similar systems, but none so robust. The hydraulics were equally impressive, cleanly routed, well protected, with filters and shut-off valves designed for quick maintenance. "It is designed for the mechanic as much as for the pilot," another technician observed. In one corner, a separate group examined the flight controls. The P-47's cockpit had already been removed and mounted on a stand. Its instrument panel gleamed with labels, switches, and dials, many with English markings still visible beneath the grime of combat. The Germans were surprised by the abundance of instruments, multiple fuel gauges, redundant pressure indicators, and color-coded warning lights. It was a pilot's office designed for clarity, minimizing the chance of error under stress. The Luftwaffe pilots had long complained that their own cockpits were cramped and inconsistent between models. Here, everything was standardized, from throttle layout to emergency systems. As the weeks passed, the German teams documented their findings in exhaustive reports. Hundreds of photographs were taken with Conta cameras, close-ups of engine mounts, turbocharger ducts, even the rivet patterns along the fuselage. They labeled each image carefully, the negatives destined for archives that might never survive the war. The work continued even as Allied bombers thundered overhead. More than once, the examination halted while the men took shelter, the distant explosions shaking the hangar walls. When the all-clear sounded, they simply returned to their benches, resuming their measurements as though nothing had happened. Among the senior engineers, the mood was complicated. There was professional respect for the American design, but also quiet despair. Every discovery reminded them of their own shortages, of materials, manpower, and time. They could understand the technology perfectly, but they could not replicate it under siege. The Reich's supply of high-grade alloys was nearly gone. Its factories lacked the stability and scale that had made this machine possible. Even the fuel that powered the Thunderbolt, high-octane aviation gasoline, was beyond their reach. One engineer, a veteran of Junkers research, summarized it during a late-night session. He stood before the dismantled turbocharger, smoke curling from his cigarette, and said softly, "They have built an engine that fights with air itself. And we have no air left." The others said nothing. They simply continued to measure, sketch, and record, driven less by curiosity now than by duty. By the end of their examination, the P-47 had become a skeleton of aluminum ribs and empty cables. Its heart, the great double Wasp engine, had been sent to another facility for separate testing. The German report, bound in gray covers, filled nearly 200 pages. It detailed every technical advantage, every material strength, every production secret. At the end, in small type, the final conclusion read, "Reproduction not feasible under current conditions." The war would end before the Germans could even attempt to imitate it. Yet the examination had given them a rare look into the industrial soul of their adversary. The Thunderbolt, a symbol of brute power and American abundance, had spoken a language of engineering they could understand but could no longer answer. The deeper the German engineers went into the captured P-47, the clearer it became that the American advantage wasn't magic, it was metallurgy. Beneath the aluminum skin, inside the pistons, valves, and turbine blades, lay secrets that had nothing to do with aerodynamics or strategy. They were the secrets of industrial chemistry, of mass-produced precision, and of an abundance of materials the Reich could only dream of by 1944. At the Luftwaffe's technical laboratory near Rechlin, a small group of metallurgists received samples cut directly from the Thunderbolt's engine. They placed the fragments, slivers of cylinder head, pieces of turbine, sections of ductwork, under microscopes and spectrographs. On the benches beside them lay rows of labeled test coupons, each one etched and polished until it gleamed. The room smelled faintly of acetone and ozone. The air was quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock and the low hum of an induction furnace heating another specimen for analysis. When the first results arrived, disbelief turned into professional respect. The Americans had achieved uniformity that the Germans could no longer guarantee. Every sample showed consistent hardness, perfect grain alignment, and an almost complete absence of impurities. The alloys were rich with nickel and chromium, elements now rationed so tightly in Germany that even frontline aircraft were flying with diluted substitutes. "We are fighting on bread made of steel dust," one metallurgist muttered bitterly. They compared the American metals to their own. A sample from a BMW 801 cylinder revealed uneven carbon deposits and microfractures at the valve seat. The P-47's piece, by contrast, showed no fatigue even after hundreds of hours of use. The difference lay in the purity of the raw materials and the precision of heat treatment. American factories could heat, quench, and temper entire engine batches under controlled conditions, guided by automatic thermocouples and timers. Germany still relied on experienced craftsmen and manual kills, an art more than a science. Under the pressure of war, art could no longer keep up with volume. The discovery that most impressed the Germans was the turbo-supercharger's turbine wheel. Its blades were cast from an advanced nickel-chromium alloy known to them only by rumor. Under the microscope, the grain structure appeared almost perfect, dense, fine, and consistent. The surface resisted oxidation even after being heated red-hot for hours. "They have mastered the metallurgy of heat," one scientist said, tracing the edge of a blade with a gloved finger. "We are chasing it in theory, they are building it in practice." Another team tested the aluminum used in the airframe. They expected the same lightweight duralumin common in Allied aircraft, but the samples revealed a more refined variant, toughened by magnesium and copper. It balanced strength and flexibility, allowing the Thunderbolt to withstand combat punishment that would crumple other fighters. German pilots had long complained that their aircraft became fragile under stress, skin panels wrinkled, joints cracked. Here, the Americans had chosen resilience over elegance. By February 1944, the laboratory walls were lined with charts comparing American and German materials. The contrasts were sobering. One report noted that even the rubber insulation around the Thunderbolt's electrical wiring was superior, smoother, more durable, less prone to cracking under cold. Another pointed out that the Americans used corrosion inhibitors and protective coatings unheard of in German factories at that stage of the war. Nothing in the P-47's construction had been left to chance. The engineers could not help but admire the system that produced such quality. They imagined the vast smelters and automated presses across the Atlantic, machines working day and night with steady electricity, endless coal, and an uninterrupted flow of raw metals. In Germany, furnaces went cold for lack of fuel, power failed without warning, rail lines were bombed faster than they could be repaired. The Reich still possessed brilliant scientists, but brilliance without material was a candle burning in a storm. One evening, as the tests concluded, a senior metallurgist gathered his notes and addressed his exhausted team. "You see," he said, "this is why we cannot win a long war. They build as if their machines were meant to live forever. We build as if they must merely survive the next flight." The men said nothing. They returned to their benches, filing away samples they would likely never be able to reproduce. The final report ran 40 pages. Its conclusions were blunt. The alloys and production methods used in the P-47 were technically remarkable and industrially unattainable within the current German economy. The authors noted that even if the Reich possessed the raw materials, it lacked the machinery to produce the same purity and uniformity. Still, there was a quiet admiration in their tone. For all their frustration, the German engineers recognized kindred spirits across the ocean, men who loved metal, who believed in the perfection of the machine. In another time, they might have worked together. But war had made colleagues into adversaries. The P-47's remains were shipped onward to another facility for further study. The metallurgists packed their microscopes and sealed their notes. Outside, the night sky glowed faintly from distant fires. Inside, the last specimen of the Thunderbolt's heart cooled on a steel bench, still shining with the light of an industrial world that Germany could no longer reach. In early 1944, a new shipment from the Reich test site arrived at the Luftwaffe's propulsion laboratory in Göttingen. It was packed in wooden crates marked Beutflugzeugteil, P-47 Thunderbolt. Inside lay the most enigmatic part of the American fighter, its turbo-supercharger system. To most of the German technicians who pried open the crates, the arrangement of pipes, ducts, and polished housings looked more like the organs of a machine creature than the workings of an aircraft. They had seen superchargers before, but nothing like this. The Germans were no strangers to forced induction. Their BMW 801 radial engines used mechanical superchargers, and the Junkers and Daimler-Benz designs relied on multi-stage compressors. But this was different. The P-47 system used exhaust gases from the engine to spin a turbine, which in turn powered a separate compressor at the tail of the aircraft. Hot gases from the cylinders traveled through long steel ducts, turned the turbine wheel, and were expelled through a vent near the rear fuselage. Meanwhile, the compressor forced cool, dense air back toward the engine, feeding it the oxygen it needed at high altitude. The setup looked absurdly complicated, a maze of tubes running the length of the fuselage, yet the Americans had somehow made it reliable. The engineers placed the turbocharger assembly on a heavy steel table. It was the size of a small barrel, its surface pitted from heat but otherwise intact. The turbine blades, made from a gleaming nickel-chromium alloy, caught the light like a mirror. One technician spun the impeller gently with his finger. It turned freely, smooth as silk. There were no signs of distortion, no cracks, no warping from temperature. "Look at this finish," another said quietly. "We could not make one like it even before the shortages." They began the disassembly, photographing each stage with meticulous care. The photographs would later form part of a secret report labeled Geheime Kommandosake, Untersuchung amerikanischer Abgasturbillator. Every bolt was numbered, every bearing inspected. They discovered that the turbine shaft rode on precision ball bearings instead of the oil film bushings used in most German units. It was a design that reduced friction and handled speed with ease, but it required perfect machining tolerances. In a world of rationed steel and worn-out lathes, such perfection was impossible to reproduce. To understand how the Americans had managed this feat, the German scientists performed chemical analyses on the alloys. They found heat-resistant metals, nickel, molybdenum, and cobalt, combined in a way that allowed the blades to endure temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius. This astonished them. The Reich's metallurgical experts had known of these metals, but they had never been able to secure them in quantity. The U.S., by contrast, drew such elements from global sources and smelted them in vast industrial complexes that operated with near-automatic precision. One report described the American turbocharger as a product of industrial abundance more than scientific novelty. It was true, the principle behind it was well known to both sides. What separated the Allies was their capacity to mass-produce something so intricate and so demanding. Each turbocharger was a miracle of consistency, turned out by the hundreds every month. Germany, struggling even to keep up with fighter production, could only envy that scale. For days, the German engineers debated whether they could adapt such a system to their own aircraft. Some argued it was impossible, the materials alone were beyond reach. Others, more optimistic, proposed simplified versions for high-altitude bombers. Drawings covered the blackboard, annotated with performance estimates and projected temperatures. Yet every calculation returned to the same obstacle, the turbine's resilience. Without the right alloys, it would fail in minutes. This is not a technical gap, said one senior researcher. It is an economic one. To confirm their findings, they attempted to run the captured turbocharger on a test rig. The turbine spun up with a piercing whine that filled the lab. At full speed it blurred into invisibility, a ghostly halo of motion. The engineers watched the temperature gauges climb. The numbers stayed steady, astonishingly steady. The bearings held. The shaft remained true. When they finally shut it down, the housing was hot enough to shimmer, but the blades were untouched. A long silence followed. They built a machine that outlasts the war itself, someone murmured. By now, the engineers understood what they were seeing was more than a clever device, it was a symbol of a philosophy. The Americans had built for reliability under pressure, even at the cost of complexity. The Germans, under siege, had been forced to simplify until nothing extra could be spared. In that divide lay the future of air power. The final report on the Thunderbolt's turbocharger was delivered in March 1944. It concluded that the design was superior in concept and execution, and currently impossible to reproduce under wartime conditions. Copies were sent to BMW and Junkers, where small teams tried to adapt some of the principles into jet engine research. In a way, the Thunderbolt's captured heart had whispered hints of the coming jet age. Months later, as Allied bombers roared overhead, one of the same engineers looked up from his desk at the sound of distant engines. The droning hum above Germany was powered by the same technologies he had studied, by factories and resources that his nation could no longer match. He returned to his notes and quietly closed the file marked, Turbocharger, P-47. The war of machines had already been decided, not in the skies, but in the furnaces and foundries of those who could build without fear of running out. When the last bolts were catalogued and the reports complete, the captured Thunderbolt ceased to be a mystery of machinery and became something far more important, a lesson. In Berlin, the Air Ministry distributed copies of the technical findings to its major aircraft and engine manufacturers, BMW, Junkers, Daimler-Benz, and Focke-Wulf. The tone of the cover memo was both practical and desperate. It instructed the engineers to extract all possible industrial and tactical knowledge for future designs. The Reich was now studying its enemy's machines as a student studies a master. Inside the offices of the Technisches Amt, the atmosphere was one of reluctant admiration. The engineers who had spent months dismantling and analyzing the P-47 were summoned to briefings where they explained their findings to officers and administrators who could scarcely believe them. Charts filled the walls, turbocharger efficiency curves, metallurgical composition tables, comparative stress diagrams. The numbers told a simple truth: the Allies had achieved a synthesis of engineering and manufacturing power that Germany could not match. In one smoky conference room, a senior Luftwaffe official tapped the report with his finger. "You mean to tell me," he said, "that their machine is heavier, less elegant, and yet performs better at high altitude?" "Joll, Herr General," the lead engineer replied. "It does." The officer frowned. "Then our problem is not science. It is industry." That conclusion hung in the air like a weight. The engineers were not men of politics, yet they understood the implications. Every advantage the Allies possessed, from the abundance of aluminum to the precision of their bearings, came from a foundation of uninterrupted production. Even if German engineers could copy the design, the factories could not sustain it. Allied bombers were already dismantling those factories, one raid at a time. Still, the lessons of the Thunderbolt were not wasted. In Augsburg, at the Messerschmitt Works, design teams pored over the American turbocharger diagrams, hoping to adapt the principles to their own engines. At Dessau, Junkers engineers compared the P-47's exhaust ducting to early jet prototypes, realizing that the same metallurgy which allowed the Americans to handle such heat could one day enable true jet propulsion. The irony was not lost on them. Studying an American piston engine was teaching them how to build a German jet. Meanwhile, at Rechlin, Luftwaffe test pilots were briefed on the Thunderbolt's flight characteristics, based on captured reports and pilot interviews. They noted its heavy frame, its stability, and its ability to dive faster than any German fighter could safely follow. "It flies like a hammer," one pilot said, reading from the American flight data, "but it hits like one too." The Germans realized that the Thunderbolt's toughness came not only from its armor but from its philosophy of over-engineering. Every component had been built to absorb punishment, in air combat, in maintenance, in logistics. The Germans, who prided themselves on precision, had optimized for performance. The Americans had optimized for endurance. It was a lesson in priorities as much as technology. Across laboratories and drafting rooms, engineers debated what could be salvaged. Some proposed simplified high-altitude systems using mechanical compressors. Others argued for improved alloys or new heat-treating processes. But most recognized that without resources, their knowledge was little more than academic. "We are like musicians studying a score," one designer said, "with no instruments left to play." Yet, despite the gloom, there was also a spark of inspiration. The Thunderbolt showed them the value of modularity, of standardization, of designing machines that could be repaired by ordinary workers instead of master craftsmen. In the final year of the war, these lessons subtly influenced several German programs. The late model FW-190D and Ta-152, the Heinkel He-219 night fighter, and even early jet designs. They were built with more accessible panels, simpler fasteners, and interchangeable parts, ideas borrowed not from German tradition but from the American factory floor. In one report circulated in the spring of 1945, a German research committee summarized the P-47's significance in words that bordered on admiration. "The American design represents not superiority of thought, but superiority of execution. Their engineers understand production as part of engineering itself. Their machines are designed for industry, not merely for flight." By the time that memo was written, Berlin itself was under bombardment. The laboratories that had once studied the Thunderbolt were reduced to rubble or evacuated to the south. Many of the men who had examined the aircraft would later find themselves working under Allied supervision, their skills redirected toward rebuilding what had been destroyed. In Allied hands, the same reports that once circulated as secret would form the basis for post-war technical cooperation, influencing engine development from both sides of the new Iron Curtain. For the Germans who had spent those long nights studying the captured P-47, the lessons were bitter but enduring. They had looked into the machine and seen not just metal, but a philosophy, the embodiment of a nation's ability to turn science into production, invention into industry, and industry into power. When the war finally ended, one surviving engineer wrote in his journal, "We thought we built for perfection, they built for victory." And that, perhaps, is the greater art. The true measure of the P-47 Thunderbolt was not found in laboratories or test stands, it was revealed in the factories that built it. As German engineers pored over their notes from the captured aircraft, they began to grasp a sobering truth. The difference between their machines and the American ones was not simply in design. It was in the scale of the world that produced them. Across the Atlantic, entire cities had become engines of manufacture. In places like Evansville, Farmingdale, and Bridgeport, the roar of machinery never stopped. Assembly lines stretched for hundreds of meters beneath roofs of glass and steel. Women in bandanas and men too old for combat stood shoulder to shoulder, riveting wings, machining pistons, fitting instruments. Day blended into night under the glare of overhead lamps, and the thunder of stamping presses echoed like a heartbeat. Every component of the P-47, from the tip of its propeller to the last screw in its cockpit, emerged from this coordinated industrial symphony. In Germany, the contrast could not have been starker. By 1944, Allied bombers ruled the skies. Factory roofs lay in twisted heaps, and production was scattered into makeshift workshops in forests and tunnels. Skilled labor was scarce, material scarcer still. Women and teenagers worked under constant air raid alarms, assembling aircraft parts by hand under candlelight when power failed. What had once been a nation of craftsmen was now surviving on improvisation. The engineers who had examined the Thunderbolt's components recognized this imbalance immediately. The Americans could afford to make parts heavy and redundant because their production lines were inexhaustible. Their raw materials came by shiploads from every corner of the globe. Germany, on the other hand, was trapped within its own borders, bleeding resources from conquered territories already stripped bare. When the German reports described the P-47's unnecessary weight, they did so not as criticism but as envy. Weight meant strength, and strength meant survival, luxuries that a starving industry could not afford. At a factory in Regensburg, a small group of managers gathered to discuss the findings from the captured P-47. They sat in a cold meeting room with blackout curtains drawn, the hum of distant generators punctuated by the occasional thud of anti-aircraft fire. The lead engineer laid out the American photos, assembly lines, conveyor systems, heat-treating furnaces glowing with uniform light. "They build airplanes the way we build watches," he said quietly. "Precise, but endless." One of the younger technicians studied the images of women riveting fuselage panels and asked, "But how do they train them so quickly?" "They do not train them," the engineer replied. "They design the work so it does not need training." That simple sentence captured the essence of the divide. German production depended on expertise, master machinists, skilled fitters, and careful inspection. American production depended on systems, jigs, fixtures, and standardized tools that made precision automatic. This realization was both humbling and terrifying. For all their technical brilliance, the Germans could not match the efficiency of a society that had turned its entire economy into a single coordinated mechanism. While German factories were moved underground to escape bombing, American plants were expanding. While Germany scavenged for alloys, the Americans were shipping complete replacement engines across oceans. The Luftwaffe's technical officers understood that no amount of innovation could offset that scale. By late 1944, the industrial gap had become a chasm. German engineers still spoke of future fighters and wonder weapons. The jet-powered Me-262, the rocket-propelled Me-163, but they knew these were desperate leaps rather than steady progress. Every design was constrained by scarcity. Aluminum was mixed with poor alloys, rivets were reused, and fuel was diluted. Each compromise echoed through the war effort. Meanwhile, American factories turned out P-47's faster than Germany could shoot them down. Inside the ruins of a once proud industrial nation, a few visionaries began to see what the future would demand. They studied the American methods not as enemies but as students. Notes circulated quietly among engineers, production flow diagrams, suggestions for modular tooling, proposals for interchangeable parts. These fragments would survive the war, smuggled through the chaos, to influence Germany's post-war rebirth. In their final report to the Luftwaffe command, the examiners summarized the situation in a tone that was both analytical and resigned. The American aircraft reflects a unity of design and production that is presently unattainable under German conditions. Their strength lies not only in the machine, but in the system that builds it. When the report reached Berlin, few had the time or resources left to act on it. The bombing was relentless. The machines that could have implemented such lessons were buried under rubble or scattered across the countryside. Yet even in those final months, the idea of the industrial divide, the recognition that war would be won not by the most ingenious design but by the most efficient production, lingered in the minds of the engineers. One of them, writing in his notebook as the war drew to its end, summed it up in a single line. "Our engineers fought a war of invention. There's fought a war of production. And production does not tire." The captured Thunderbolt, long since stripped for study, had become more than a marvel of machinery. It had become a mirror, showing both what Germany had achieved and what it had lost. The engineers had seen into the heart of the American arsenal and discovered that its real power was not in horsepower or metal, but in the endless rhythm of factories that could outbuild the storm. By the spring of 1945, the examination of the captured P-47 Thunderbolt had long been completed, but its ghost still lingered in the minds of those who studied it. In hangars reduced to half-light, in laboratories where the power flickered and equipment stood covered in dust, German engineers still spoke of the machine, the American giant, as they called it. It had become more than an aircraft, it was a symbol of the war they were losing. The reports, now dog-eared and oil-stained, circulated through the collapsing hierarchy of the Luftwaffe's technical departments. Some pages were missing, others burned in office stoves for warmth. What survived told a consistent story: the Thunderbolt represented a kind of warfare Germany could no longer sustain. Its power came not from genius but from infrastructure, from an economy that could feed an army of factories with unbroken rhythm. For men who had spent their lives believing that precision and intellect could triumph over mass, the lesson was painful. At Oberammergau, in the Bavarian Alps, a small detachment of Luftwaffe scientists had relocated their research center into a requisitioned school building. The walls still bore chalk diagrams of the P-47's turbocharger and cooling systems, now smudged by months of handling. Outside, Allied bombers thundered overhead on their way to Munich. Every tremor of the earth reminded them that analysis meant little against industrial supremacy. Inside the building, the last phase of their study took a new turn. They began comparing what they had learned from the Thunderbolt with their own experimental technologies: the jet engines of the Me-262, the rocket propulsion of the Me-163, and the high-altitude concepts for the Ta-152. The irony was inescapable: the lessons drawn from a piston-engine American fighter were being used to shape the first German jets. Yet even here, the same truth persisted. The jet engines promised incredible speed, but they failed after a few hours of operation because the alloys could not endure the heat. Germany could design the future, it could not build it. In April, as Allied troops crossed the Rhine, the research center received orders to destroy sensitive documents. One evening, as the scientists stood by the furnace feeding in papers, one of them paused over a page, a photograph of the P-47's radial engine, annotated with his own handwriting. "We could never have made this," he said quietly. "Not because we lacked the minds, because we lacked the means." He slipped the photograph into his coat instead of the fire. It would become one of the few surviving artifacts of the examination. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the lessons learned from the Thunderbolt were being demonstrated daily, not by Germany, but against it. The skies above the Reich swarmed with Allied aircraft, many of them P-47's. They roared over rail lines and convoys, diving from the clouds with the same engines the Germans had once studied in awe. Each sortie seemed to mock the engineers' reports, proving the truth of every word they had written: the Americans had mastered the art of sustained, mechanical warfare. For German pilots still flying, the sight of the Thunderbolt was a grim reminder. They called it der Bulldozer, the bulldozer, because it seemed unstoppable. It could absorb hits that would shatter a Bf-109, pull out of dives that broke other planes apart, and keep flying home with half its cylinders dead. In the final months of the war, many Luftwaffe veterans admitted that they no longer feared the pilot in the cockpit as much as the machine itself. The P-47 embodied endurance, the very quality Germany had lost. In the ruins of Berlin, as Soviet artillery closed in, the last of the technical archives were buried or burned. But some survived, captured intact by Allied intelligence units. When American officers reviewed the German analysis, they were astonished by its accuracy. The Germans had understood every technical detail, every pressure ratio, alloy composition, and cooling system nuance. What they had lacked was the capacity to act upon that understanding. Their brilliance had become academic, their engineering a record of what might have been. After the surrender, several of the same engineers who had examined the Thunderbolt were questioned by Allied intelligence under Operation Paperclip. When asked about their impressions of the American machine, one of them, a quiet, bespectacled researcher named Dr. Helmut Weiss, gave a simple answer. "It was not the aircraft that defeated us. It was the world that built it." His words would echo through the post-war years. Some of the men who had studied the P-47 went on to work in the very industries that had once been their adversaries, helping rebuild Germany under Allied supervision. They brought with them the lessons of the Thunderbolt: standardization, modular design, reliability over perfection. These principles would later shape the factories of the new West Germany, lessons born not from victory, but from defeat. In the final months of the war, the captured P-47 itself vanished from records. Some say it was destroyed in a bombing raid, others claim it was dismantled and its pieces scattered among different test centers. But to the men who studied it, the aircraft had already served its purpose. It had revealed a truth that no amount of propaganda could obscure: technology wins battles, but production wins wars. And so, as the Reich crumbled and silence returned to its shattered skies, the memory of that American fighter lingered, not as an enemy, but as a teacher. When the war ended, the P-47 Thunderbolt remained more than a fighter plane, it was a symbol of industrial willpower. Its captured fragments, studied in dim German laboratories, had revealed not just American technology but an entire philosophy of warfare. Strength through simplicity. Power through production. Reliability over refinement. For the German engineers who once examined it, the memory lingered. Some would later rebuild their nation's industries, carrying with them the same lessons the Thunderbolt had taught them: design for endurance, plan for scale, trust in the machine, not just the man. Across the Atlantic, thousands of Thunderbolts were scrapped, melted, or forgotten. Yet in every piston engine, every jet turbine that came after, echoes of its design endured. The P-47's massive heart, the R-2800 double Wasp, had shown what happened when ingenuity met abundance. In the quiet decades that followed, one truth outlived the war: the Germans had examined a single American fighter and seen the future. It was not just the roar of horsepower that had defeated them, but the relentless rhythm of factories that never slept. The Thunderbolt was more than metal, it was the sound of victory forged in industry.